The world expected silence after the indictment dropped. Instead, Moscow reacted almost instantly. And that reaction may have revealed more than Washington ever intended. Because when the Trump Justice Department moved against Raul Castro over the 1996 Brothers to the Rescue shootdown, Russia didn't act like a distant observer. It acted like a protector. Within 24 hours, the Kremlin publicly defended Cuba, accused the United States of interference, and openly pledged support for Havana. For many Americans, this may sound like Cold War history repeating itself, but this time the timing matters. Because the response didn't come after sanctions, troop movements, or missile threats. It came after legal charges. And that tells us something important. The alliance between Russia and Cuba is not symbolic anymore. It is active, strategic, and extremely sensitive to pressure from Washington. To understand why this story matters, you have to go back nearly 30 years. In February 1996, two civilian aircraft belonging to the anti-Castro group Brothers to the Rescue were shot down over international waters. 4 men were killed, including 3 American citizens. The incident shocked the United States and intensified tensions with Cuba at a time when the communist government was already struggling after the collapse of the Soviet Union. For decades, critics argued that those responsible at the highest levels of the Cuban regime were never fully held accountable. Now, according to reports surrounding the Trump DOJ indictment, prosecutors are attempting to directly connect Raul Castro to the decision chain behind that deadly attack. Whether the case succeeds in court is one issue, but politically, the signal was loud and unmistakable. Washington was no longer treating the Castro era as untouchable history.
And that is exactly why the Kremlin reacted so aggressively. Russia today is not the Soviet Union, but Cuba still carries enormous symbolic value for Moscow. The island sits only 90 miles from Florida, and throughout the Cold War, it represented one of the Soviet Union's greatest geopolitical victories against the United States. Even after the Soviet collapse, Russian leaders never completely abandoned Havana. Over the years, Moscow quietly rebuilt influence through intelligence cooperation, military visits, economic agreements, and energy support. By 2026, that relationship had become increasingly visible. Russian oil shipments helped keep Cuba's struggling economy functioning, while political coordination between the two governments intensified behind the scenes. So when Trump's DOJ publicly targeted Raul Castro, Moscow saw more than a legal case. It saw Washington challenging a long-protected ally and exposing a relationship Russia preferred to keep in the shadows. Then came the statement that changed everything. On May 21, Russian Foreign Ministry spokesperson Maria Zakharova publicly condemned the indictment. She called the case gross interference in the internal affairs of a sovereign state. She accused the United States of reviving the Monroe Doctrine and promised active Russian support for Cuba. Think about that carefully. Russia was not merely disagreeing with American policy, it was stepping forward as Cuba's international shield. And for many observers, the speed of the response mattered as much as the words themselves. Countries usually move cautiously when legal accusations involve foreign political leaders, but Moscow appeared alarmed enough to react immediately, almost as if the indictment threatened something larger beneath the surface. That is where this story becomes bigger than Cuba, because Americans watching this unfold are seeing the emergence of a familiar global pattern. Russia increasingly positions itself as the defender of anti-Western governments under pressure from Washington. We've seen versions of this strategy in Syria, Venezuela, Iran, and now once again in Cuba. The message is simple. If a regime opposes the United States, Moscow will attempt to keep it alive politically, economically, or militarily. And in return, Russia gains influence close to America's sphere of interest. During the Cold War, this strategy nearly brought the world to nuclear war during the Cuban Missile Crisis. Today, the tactics look different, but the geopolitical logic remains remarkably similar.
What makes this especially explosive is the hypocrisy many critics immediately pointed out. The Kremlin condemned American interference while continuing its own war in Ukraine. For American voters, especially conservatives who support Trump's harder line against communist governments, that contradiction is impossible to ignore. Russia lectures Washington about sovereignty while simultaneously projecting military force across Eastern Europe. To Trump supporters, Moscow's reaction looked less like diplomacy and more like panic, a sign that the DOJ indictment touched a nerve strong enough to force the Kremlin into public defense mode. And there's another layer Americans should not overlook. Cuba has consistently framed his foreign policy around strength, deterrence, and confrontation against adversarial regimes. During his presidency, Cuba sanctions tightened dramatically. His administration reversed Obama-era normalization efforts and pushed a far more aggressive posture toward Havana. Now, with the DOJ indictment emerging under a Trump political environment, supporters see this moment as proof that pressure works. Their argument is straightforward. When Washington hits hard enough, alliances hidden behind diplomatic language suddenly become visible. But critics warn there could also be risks. Cuba remains economically fragile, politically unstable, and strategically valuable to both Russia and China. Increased pressure from Washington could push Havana even deeper into Moscow's orbit. Some analysts fear that escalating tensions could reopen a Cold War-style standoff in the Western Hemisphere, especially if Russia decides to expand intelligence or military cooperation near U.S. territory. Others argue that Moscow's dramatic response may actually reveal weakness rather than strength. Russia, already stretched internationally, cannot afford to lose one of its few remaining allies close to the American mainland. In that interpretation, the Kremlin's public defense of Cuba was less about confidence and more about fear of losing influence. And that brings us to the most important question. Why should ordinary Americans care about a decades-old shoot-down case involving Cuba? Because this story is not really about the past anymore. It is about what the reaction revealed in the present. The indictment pulled back the curtain on a geopolitical relationship many people assumed belonged to history books. Instead, it exposed an active partnership between Moscow and Cuba, operating during one of the most unstable global periods in decades, a partnership Russia was willing to defend immediately and publicly. For years, critics dismissed concerns about renewed Russian influence in the Western Hemisphere as exaggeration, but now the evidence is becoming harder to ignore. Energy support, political coordination, diplomatic shielding, and rapid, synchronized messaging all point towards something more serious than symbolic friendship. The old Cold War network never completely disappeared. It adapted. And when pressure arrived from Washington, the response came fast enough to reveal exactly where loyalties still stand. In the end, the most revealing part of this entire episode may not be the indictment itself. It may be the reaction it triggered. Trump's DOJ hit Havana with legal pressure tied to one of the darkest incidents in U.S.-Cuba history. Instead of staying quiet, Russia rushed into the spotlight and defended the regime almost instantly. That single move told the world what years of quiet diplomacy tried to conceal. The alliance is real. The Kremlin considers Cuba strategically important, and when Washington applies pressure, Moscow is prepared to answer publicly. The Cold War may have officially ended decades ago, but moments like this suggest some of its deepest fault lines never truly disappeared.